All right, well, I have 5 o'clock on the dot, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shannon Rowan. I am the Program Director for Civic Outreach at the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual. CSGI exists to explore the constitutional, economic, political, and social foundations of a free and prosperous society. Uh, we hold programs just like this one on a regular basis to provide a forum for discussion, for education, and for all of us to share our collective love for politics and government. In addition to programs like the Refresher Course, CSGI also offers continuing education programs to secondary social studies teachers, and we'll be doing a lot of fun things in the year ahead. But I am super excited for our session tonight, and it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Tonight is session 4 in the Civics Refresher Course, and we will be discussing the evolution and history of American political parties. And we have just the person here at UCCS to do that. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Verlan Lewis, who is a professor here in the Poli-Sci department here at UCCS. He also recently published a book entitled The Ideas of Power, The Politics of American Party Ideology Development. We couldn't find somebody better if we tried, and he's right here in Colorado Springs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Verlan just with a quick reminder. Please feel free to ask questions using either the chat function or the raise your hand function. If you hover your mouse down towards the bottom of your Zoom box, you click reactions and you'll see the button for hand raise. We will have 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. And Verlan, they are all yours.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. I want to thank CSGI for putting on this event. I think it's a wonderful series, and in particular, I want to thank Shannon for organizing this evening's event. I know the Civics Refresher mini-series, that she's the driving force behind this new programming at CSGI. I think it's a great idea. So we're glad to have Shannon joining us at CSGI this year and for all that she's been doing. So as Shannon said, I am going to talk about political parties today, and I'm not going to lecture for the whole hour, so don't worry. But I do have a few slides I want to go through, and then I want to have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. And also throughout, I'm happy to have a conversation as we go throughout. So political parties is something that we hear a lot about in the news. It's something that people talk about a lot. It's something that my students are always interested in. But today we're going to try and step back a little bit and look at some of the history behind American political parties. So if I pull up my share screen, let's see if this will work. Okay, Shannon, is that working okay?
Nope, we are seeing a calendar invite.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see.
That's okay. It's to this event, so that's a good thing.
Okay, so it says I'm screen sharing. Let's see. Let me escape out of that. Is that any better?
Nope.
Okay, I'll stop share.
Yep.
And try again.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. So as we talk about American political parties, the two parties that we hear about the most in American politics are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And for good reason. Most Americans identify with either of those two major parties. So this graphic here is from Gallup. They track how many people identify with the two major parties in American politics over time. And as you can see on the x-axis there is the last 25 years of history, and the numbers have remained pretty constant. The red line represents Republicans, the blue line represents Democrats, and the gray line represents independents. And so about a third of Americans have typically identified themselves as Republican, about a third have identified as Democrats, and about a third as independent of the two major parties, either identifying with one of the smaller minor third parties or not identifying with any political party at all. So as you can see, 2/3 of Americans identify with one of the two major parties. And so that's a big fact of American life. And it seems like you can't really read the news or engage in a political discussion without parties coming up. We hear about it all the time. Here's some of the logos for the parties you might be familiar with. Of course, in the top right-hand corner, you have the Republican logo of the elephant. In the bottom left, you've got the donkey for the Democrats, and then some of the other minor third parties that we have in American politics. Just recently, I pulled this up from the Washington Post. Here was a talk about the Patriot Party. This is a new party that's being discussed in American politics. After Trump lost his reelection bid, he hinted that there might be a third party, a Patriot Party that emerged out of the Republican Party. And as the Washington Post points out, there was actually a Patriot Party in American history. It was a socialist party that existed previously. So we hear about parties a lot, but I want to get into today what exactly is a political party. The textbook definition that I share with my students in the classes I teach is a political party is a group of people who try to influence what government does by putting their own members into office under the party label. So there's lots of different groups in politics. There's different interest groups, and interest groups try to influence what government does, but political parties are a particular kind of interest group in that they try to influence what government does by getting their members into government offices and running and campaigning on the party label. In American politics, typically as a Republican or as a Democrat. And political parties, when political scientists analyze parties, they think of parties in three separate parts. There's three different levels of the party you can think about. First is the party and the electorate. That's what we talked about when I showed that graph from Gallup surveys. That is ordinary people, voters who identify with one of the two major parties. The second level is the party organization. When we talk about the party organization, we're thinking of the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee. These are leaders of the party organization. They help write the platform every 4 years. They help organize the party convention every 4 years. And on the state and local level, they help recruit candidates to run for political office. So the party organization is also multi-layered. There's a national party organization, but there's also state and local party organizations. And then finally, we can think of the party in government. And that is the group of people in government who identify with one of the two major parties. They meet together in Congress, they caucus together, and they vote together, and they act together. They act in concert. And so that's the party in government. So we'll talk about all three of those levels of the political party in our discussion this evening. Okay, here's another headline I saw from The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, and it was talking about the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a kind of quasi-party organization. It's not necessarily a minor third party, but it's almost like a party faction. It's an organization that doesn't necessarily run candidates on its label to gain office, but it tries to influence what government does by supporting certain candidates. So the DSA endorsed and supported Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic Party primary race. But in the general election, it wasn't satisfied with either Biden or Trump, and so it refrained from nominating or endorsing either candidate. Okay, so that's just some of the ways that we see parties in the news. Now, as I said, I want to step back a little bit and take more of a bird's eye view of American political parties, and in particular, look at their historical development. So there's three parts to my presentation today. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the origins of American political parties and try to answer the question, why do we have political parties? In the second part of my presentation today, I'll talk about the historical development of the parties that we have in America, and we'll look at the 6 party systems that historians typically think of when they talk about the history of American parties. There's been 6 eras or 6 party systems. And then third, I'll finish and conclude by reflecting on what America's parties look like today and what are some of the good things that parties are doing? What are some things we should be worried about from American political parties? Okay, so the first question, why parties? So it's a good question because when we think about American politics, we typically think of the United States Constitution structuring our political system. And the Constitution doesn't say anything about parties. You won't find that word in the United States Constitution. So why do we have them? I think the Constitution creates Congress in Article 1, and it makes sense that we have a House of Representatives and a Senate. The Constitution creates the office of the presidency in Article 2, so it would make sense that we have a president. And the Constitution creates the judiciary in Article 3. So of course it makes sense that we have a Supreme Court and other federal courts. But why political parties? Well, there's a couple reasons for this. One is that parties are inevitable, that they exist not just in American politics, but they exist in all political regimes. So here's a quote from James Madison, one of the most influential and thoughtful of America's founders. He helped author the series of essays known as the Federalist Papers, advocating for ratification of the United States Constitution. And of course, he also served as the fourth president of the United States, in addition to being the principal architect of the United States Constitution. So in one of his Federalist essays, number 10, Madison explained that parties are inevitable. He says, quote, "As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. Thus ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties." So Madison is saying, no matter what you do in politics, no matter what kind of structure you provide, you're always going to have parties, because politics is about opinions. People make arguments in politics based on opinions, and opinions are disputable. And so these disputes over political arguments will inevitably lead to parties. James Madison was not alone in making this argument. George Washington also believed that parties are inevitable. And he worried about party spirit in his farewell address in 1796. After he finished his second term as the first president of the United States, Washington wrote out this farewell address, and he warned Americans about parties. He said, quote, "Party spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed." So again, regardless of the system of government you have, regardless of the kind of constitution you write, you're always going to have political parties. It's just that they will be more or less controlled. And so for Washington, who was concerned about parties, the question is how best to control the worst aspects of political parties. So when we think about the origins of American political parties, we can think of the Whigs and the Tories. Now, it makes sense that Americans would use those party names because they inherited a lot of their political institutions from Great Britain. And the first political issue that really divided Americans as Americans was the Revolution. Of course, each of the state governments, each of the colonies had political issues within them as colonies, but the first national issue that really divided Americans across the different colonies was this idea of whether the American colonies should declare independence from Great Britain. And so the rebels who wanted to declare independence called themselves Whigs. This was the name of the party in Great Britain that tended to be more critical of royal power and more supportive of parliamentary power. The loyalists who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown were called Tories. And this was associated with the political party in Great Britain that tended to be more in favor of royal power. So the two pictures I have here are John Hancock on the left, right? One of the most famous of the revolutionary Whigs, one of the Sons of Liberty who helped organize a lot of the revolutionary actions in Boston during the 1770s. And then on the right, you have William Franklin, who was perhaps the leader, considered the leader of the Loyalist movement in the American colonies. Ironically, William was the son of the most famous American at that time, Benjamin Franklin. We know Benjamin Franklin was a Whig who supported American independence, but his son, William, was a famous Loyalist. Well, after the American Revolution was over, after the American colonies won their independence from Great Britain, a lot of the Loyalists either left the country or hid the fact that they had been Loyalists before. A lot of them went to Canada. Many of them went back to England, like William Franklin did. And so you didn't have Tories anymore in America. Everyone was a Whig who supported American independence. So the next issue that split Americans was the question of whether or not to ratify the United States Constitution. In 1787, delegates at the Philadelphia Convention had come up with a new national governing document, a new national constitution that they put before the American people and asked them to either accept or reject. And this new constitution divided the American people between Federalists who wanted to ratify this new constitution and anti-Federalists who wanted to reject the proposed constitution. So on the left there, you have famous anti-Federalist George Mason. He was actually one of the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention who refused to sign the Constitution and worked against its ratification. And on the right, you have one of the most famous Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, who is now once again famous in American popular culture because of the hit Broadway production. But Hamilton was also at the Philadelphia Convention, and he worked strenuously along with James Madison to get the Constitution ratified by the American people. And he joined Madison in writing those Federalist essays in New York newspapers, trying to convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. So those were the first two party splits in American political history. Now, after the Constitution was ratified, the anti-Federalists didn't leave the country the way that the Loyalists did. They were still around. Some of them came around to the Constitution, but some continued to work within the new system to try to prevent what they considered its most problematic aspects and work against its worst excesses. And so in this new Constitution, Americans were still wary of political parties, and they feared in a republic what parties might do. They hoped that the country would unify after the Constitution's ratification and that the party divisions would cease. So here is a quote from William Livingston, one of America's founders from New Jersey, making the case for why he worried about parties or why parties could be dangerous or what the negative aspects of parties are. And he argued basically that political parties make people irrational. It makes them emotional. So he says, quote, "From the moment men give themselves up to a party, they abandon their reason. They follow their leaders with an implicit faith, and like a company of dragoons, obey the word of command without hesitation. Instead of an impartial examination of the principles he acts upon, he contents himself with exclaiming against the real or supposititious faults of his antagonists." So even though William Livingston wrote this in the 18th century, there's certainly a lot of true principles that are carrying over even into politics today. Political scientists survey people and ask them how they feel about America's two major parties. And they find that for many Americans, they don't so much love the party that they identify with, but they hate the party that they are opposed to. And so that's driving so much of the partisanship even today. But William Livingston said this is the case all the time. Instead of an impartial examination of the principles upon which a voter acts, they content themselves with simply criticizing the real or supposed faults of their opponents. James Madison, as we pointed out earlier, was also worried about what parties might do in a republic. Of course, this was ironic because James Madison, after he wrote this in 1787, a few years later, helped found one of the first of the two major parties in American politics. But in his Federalist 10, he wrote, quote, "The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. A zeal for different opinions have divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good." So Madison was warning Americans about the same thing that Livingston was. If people become so attached to a political party, they'll end up spending all their time and energy trying to oppress or conquer or beat their opponents rather than trying to cooperate for the common good of all Americans. And so partisanship can kind of turn into a kind of zealotry or tribalism that's inflamed with animosity and hostility, rather more than a love of the country. So given this problem, given the founders' fears about political parties, what's the solution? Well, Madison proposed a solution in his 10th Federalist essay. And his solution was the United States Constitution, which he had helped write and which he was trying to get ratified. He said the Constitution is a great document for a lot of reasons. In fact, there's 85 essays of the Federalist Papers saying all the virtues of the Constitution. But in Federalist 10, he focuses on what it does for factions or parties. He says the Constitution is good because it creates a democracy where the people rule. The Constitution is governed by majority rule. For a law to be passed in Congress, it has to get support from majorities in both the House and in the Senate. For a person to become elected president, they have to get a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. And so it requires majorities. Well, that's a good thing because you will be able to avoid the problem of minority tyranny. That is some faction or party in society that makes up only a minority of the population. It will prevent them from getting power and being able to impose their will on everyone else. So it prevents minority tyranny. But Madison says the genius of the American Constitution is it also prevents majority tyranny. So Madison looked at the democracies that had been created in the various states after the Revolution. And they all did a good job of preventing minority tyranny because they were all based on majority rule. But the problem he saw in the state constitutions was that they allowed for majority tyranny. So you had, state legislatures in Rhode Island inflating the currency to help the majority faction, the agrarian interest, the debtors in society to be able to pay back their debts. But it violated the rights of property owners, of creditors. And this hurt the economy of Rhode Island overall. It hurt everyone. It was not for the common good, even though it served the interests of a majority. Or in states like Pennsylvania, where the majority was able to persecute the Quaker minority and prevent them from voting and participating in politics. This was majority tyranny that Madison worried about. It was taking place in the states. And Madison says the solution is ratify this new constitution that we've created. And it will enlarge democracy over such a large territory that you won't just have a few factions in your politics, you'll have dozens of factions. And so because there'll be so many different groups, no one group will ever be big enough to get a majority. So as he says famously in Federalist 10, quote, extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. So this is Madison's argument for pluralism. Create a plurality of interests and factions and parties in society so that no one party will ever have a majority of the votes and they will never be able to impose majority tyranny. to get anything done, they'll have to form coalitions with other factions and groups in society. They'll have to moderate and compromise to get things done. And this will prevent majority tyranny. So for Madison, he hoped that the Constitution he helped write would prevent the problems that come with political parties. Okay, so as we know, again, why this question, why parties? The Constitution in some ways requires parties, or if not parties, at least it requires majorities. As I mentioned earlier, for a law to be passed in Congress, it has to have a majority of the votes in the House and in the Senate. And so this requires members of Congress to form majority coalitions to get legislation passed. Or, for example, the Constitution creates in Article 2 an institution that we call the Electoral College. And in order for a president to be chosen by this Electoral College, the president has to receive a majority of the votes of the electors. And so this requires forming a coalition of these electors to get to a majority to choose a president. So majorities are required in the Democratic Constitution, and Madison wanted to help prevent its worst tendencies. So we see parties first emerge in Congress. That's the first place that we see parties emerge in American political history. And it happens in the very first Congress. George Washington, who was elected the first president by the Electoral College, takes the oath of office, and he fills a cabinet by making appointments to his executive branch. And he chooses many of the luminaries from the American Revolution and from the Constitutional Convention to be in his cabinet. John Adams, right, the famous American who had served as ambassador to Great Britain, was Washington's vice president as chosen by the Electoral College. But then Washington also appointed Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of the Treasury. He chose Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. And in accordance with the Constitution, Washington had Hamilton draw up some reports to make recommendations to Congress on what kind of legislation should be passed. And so Alexander Hamilton made 3 historical reports to that first Congress. The report on public credit, in which he called for the United States national government to assume the debts of the various states. His report on the national bank, in which he encouraged Congress to create a national bank that could loan money and invest in companies and projects to help spur growth in the American economy. And his report on manufacturers, when he called on Congress to subsidize manufacturing in the American economy to help prop up infant industries by giving bonuses to manufacturers, by protecting them with tariffs, that is, import taxes, so that they can compete with foreign goods that are being purchased by American consumers. And so we made all these suggestions, and some people were opposed to these policies. In particular, James Madison, his former co-author of the Federalist Papers, was serving in the House of Representatives and opposed these measures. And Madison's good friend, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, was also opposed to these policies. And Madison and Jefferson saw that Hamilton was able to get these policies enacted in Congress. As each one went through, he would cobble together a different coalition of members of Congress to pass these bills. And it wasn't always the same group. And so Jefferson and Madison decided, well, if we form a caucus in Congress, a group of people who are opposed to more of these measures than they are supportive of them, we can all agree to all vote against these measures and prevent any of them from getting passed. But if instead we don't bind together and form a caucus, then we'll be picked off, a few of us on each measure, and Hamilton will get his whole agenda passed through. And so this was the origin of the first party system in American history, between Hamilton's party and Jefferson and Madison's party. So Jefferson and Madison criticized Hamilton as the leader of an anti-Republican oligarchy intent on instituting a British-style monarchy. They criticized Hamilton for giving too much power to the national government and to the president of the United States in particular. They basically criticized Hamilton for bringing to fruition the worst fears of the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, remember, had opposed the Constitution because they said, look, if we ratify this new Constitution, we're going to turn into an empire. We're going to turn into a monarchy. The president will be a king. The Supreme Court and the Senate will be a new aristocracy. And we will lose everything that we fought the revolution for. We'll lose the democracy that we lost lives over. Everything that we had fought for we'll lose if we ratify this new Constitution. And Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, had to reassure his friends, saying, no, don't worry, it won't turn into that, it will remain a republic. But when Madison started seeing what Hamilton was proposing, he worried that exactly what the Anti-Federalists predicted was going to come to pass. And so Madison and Jefferson formed a group of members of Congress, a caucus, who joined together to resist Hamilton's policies. And they called themselves Republicans. And so you can see here this picture, right, little Photoshop, George Washington with the royal crown and get up. This is what the Republicans feared. They feared the creation of a monarchy in America. So that was what the Republicans feared, and they criticized their Federalist opponents for forming a kind of oligarchy. But of course, the Federalists were also worried about the kind of political party that was being formed by Jefferson and Madison. They derisively called these Republicans Democrats, which was a kind of insult back then, because they felt like they believed in mob rule and they wanted too much democracy, that if Madison and Jefferson and the other Republicans got their way, that the United States would end up like France and have blood running through the streets, the kind of reign of terror that came about in the French Revolution. So Alexander Hamilton was joined by John Adams in the Federalist Party, and they criticized Republicans for creating a seditious opposition faction that would overturn the established national government and lead to French-style revolution and anarchy. So of course we have a picture here of the French Revolution. So Jefferson was the leader of the Republican Party and Hamilton was the leader of the Federalist Party. And this was what historians call the first party system. It was the first party split under the United States Constitution. It came about first in Congress in the 1790s, and the Republicans called for less national government power, more states' rights, whereas the Federalists wanted more national government power. So George Washington remarkably stepped down from office after only 2 terms in office. And this was really unprecedented in world history for someone to voluntarily give up power. That doesn't happen very often in the history of world politics, for someone who has a lot of political power to give it up voluntarily. But that's exactly what Washington did, and he set a precedent for those who followed after him to step down after their term of service. And in his 1796 farewell address, he warned Americans, as I said earlier, about political parties. He said, quote, "One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection." So Washington saw parties emerging within his own cabinet, right? His Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, were at war with each other over policy. And he worried that the southern states would become all Republican and the northern states would become all Federalist, and that the Union would be rent asunder by these political parties. And so this was his kind of farewell warning to the American people against political parties. He not only was worried about geographic parties ending the union of the states, but he was worried about parties leading to despotism. So parties could not only on the one hand lead to a fracture of the union, a kind of secession of states from the union, but it could also lead, even more ominously, to tyranny. He said, quote, "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." So Washington, in a prescient warning that we should take heed of today, warned Americans about a spirit of party that would cause people to constantly be motivated by revenge, by hatred of their political opponents, wanting to oppress their political opponents, take away the rights of their opponents, to dominate their opponents, and that this would lead to a misery in politics as the different factions alternated control of government. They would constantly be seeking to punish their enemies rather than promote the common good. And this would ultimately result in a kind of demagoguery, where one individual would promise, if only the American people would give him all the power, that he would solve these miseries once and for all. And this demagogue would become a tyrant, and he would be elevated on the ruins of public liberty. Okay, so we talked about how political parties emerged in Congress first. Parties also emerged in the Electoral College in the presidential selection of 1796. Washington was unanimously supported by the American states and by the Electoral College in his two elections in 1789 and 1792. But when he indicated that he was not going to serve a third term, there was a competition among the two parties for the presidency. And the states that were more supportive of Jefferson's Republican Party started organizing within their state legislatures saying, let's pick presidential electors who we know will support Jefferson in the presidential vote. And northern states who were more sympathetic to Alexander Hamilton and John Adams's Federalist Party started to organize in their state legislatures and say, let's only pick presidential electors who will vote for Adams as president. So rather than choosing wise or judicious or virtuous members of their community to make an independent choice about who they thought should be president, they made a partisan selection, choosing presidential electors who they trusted would support the partisan choice, their party's candidate. And so that's exactly what happened in 1796. Each state legislature chose presidential electors who were partisans and would support each party's candidate. And Adams narrowly beat Jefferson in the presidential election of 1796. And during his term in office, the Federalists, as mentioned earlier, treated the Republicans as seditious. And the Federalist Congress passed, and John Adams signed into law, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. That, among other things, allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens that he deemed dangerous. Right? So the Federalists were worried that there were immigrants coming over from the European continent who were filled with these revolutionary ideas, who were filled with these radical ideas they'd imbibed from the French Revolution, and they were going to come to America and spread these revolutionary ideas and would topple the national government. And the Alien Enemies Act empowered the president to imprison and deport non-citizens from a hostile nation. America was at war with France at the time, and so this gave the president the power to get rid of French immigrants who he worried might be opposed to the current regime. And then finally, the Sedition Act criminalized making false statements critical of the national government. So while Adams didn't deport anyone with the Alien Acts, he did shut down some newspapers under the Sedition Act, prosecuting these newspaper editors for criticizing the Federalist government. and saying that these were false statements. Of course, this created a backlash in American society among those who supported the Republican Party and were critical of Adams. And so this led to what historians sometimes call the Revolution of 1800, the Second Revolution, when American voters threw out the Federalist Party and put into power the Republican Party. And this, in some ways, was the first peaceful transfer of power in American history. There wasn't a single drop of blood shed in transitioning from the Federalist Party of Adams to the Republican Party of Jefferson. This was extraordinary in world history, that the Federalists would simply step down. No, we lost the election, we'll step down. We're not going to fight about it. We're not going to have a war. We're not going to have a civil war. We're not going to try and stay in power regardless of what the will of the people is. And that was unusual in American history. And we've taken it for granted over the past 220 years. But I think recent events remind us that we can't take a peaceful transition of power for granted. We should be really grateful for that tradition in American history. Fortunately for us, not only was Washington not a tyrant, and not only was Adams not a tyrant, but neither was Jefferson. When he came into power and became president, he didn't try to prosecute his former political enemies. Instead, he was committed to the pluralism that Madison had helped set up in the United States Constitution. He tolerated dissent within America and allowed Federalists to criticize the Republican administration. He said something remarkable in his 1801 inaugural address when he first became president. He said, quote, "Though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail," he's thinking here of the Republican majority that's just come into power, "that will to be rightful must be reasonable. The minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind, and let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance, as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions." So Jefferson called for limited government. He didn't want to empower the national government. He wanted it to be limited. He called for laissez-faire economic policies. He said in his inaugural address, "What more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people? A wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government." So in winning the presidential election of 1800 and winning control of Congress, and when the Republicans came to power in the Revolution of 1800, Jefferson wanted to end the partisan conflict that had characterized the 1790s. And so he said in his inaugural, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We're all Republicans. We're all Federalists." So he wanted Americans to unite together and to support the common good and no longer be divided into parties. But of course, this goes against what we talked about earlier in the presentation. As Washington and Madison said, parties are inevitable. Jefferson was hoping for something that is impossible, at least in the long term. Jefferson got his wish in the short term. It is true that the Federalist Party dissolved during the Jeffersonian era. The Federalist Party won only 2 states in the presidential election of 1804. The Federalist candidate just got a few electoral college votes. They didn't even field a candidate in 1812. Instead, the incumbent president, James Madison, was challenged by another Republican, DeWitt Clinton, an anti-war Republican, critical of Madison's prosecution of the War of 1812. The Federalists didn't nominate a presidential candidate in 1816, and in 1820, Madison's successor, James Monroe, won the election unanimously. And so the Federalist Party went away, and it was really just the Republican Party left. But as we said, it's really impossible for parties to entirely disappear, even if everyone uses the same label. And so Thomas Jefferson warned his friends that their former Federalist enemies were simply calling themselves Republicans, but they were promoting the old policies of Hamilton. He said in one letter, quote, "All indeed call themselves by the name of Republicans, Finding that monarchy is a desperate wish in this country, they rallied to the point which they think next best, a consolidated government. Hence, new Republicans in Congress preaching the doctrines of the old Federalists. So today you'll hear in the news, people talk about rhinos, Republicans in name only. Well, Jefferson was talking about rhinos back in the 1820s. So the next presidential election of 1824 was nonpartisan. There were 4 major candidates and they all considered themselves Republicans, but they all had a different base of support. Well, as you can imagine, if there are 4 candidates in a general election, it's unlikely that any one candidate will get a majority of the Electoral College votes. And that's exactly what happened. The vote was split 4 ways, nobody got a majority. And you may not know this, but the Constitution says if no one gets a majority of Electoral College votes, the House of Representatives chooses the president. So in the House, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. He wasn't in the top 3, so he wasn't eligible to be chosen by his House of Representatives, but he worked to help get his fellow members of the House to support John Quincy Adams, who was also a kind of nationalist who wanted more national government power, even though Andrew Jackson actually had the most Electoral College votes. So Jackson was incensed by this. Adams made Clay his Secretary of State, which was kind of stepping stone to become the next president. Jackson called this a corrupt bargain. And party divisions emerged once again in 1828 when John Quincy Adams ran for re-election. Supporters of Adams called themselves National Republicans, and they were opposed by supporters of Jackson who called themselves Democratic Republicans. Eventually, so Jackson beat Adams in the 1828 election, and all the people opposed to Jackson formed a coalition they called Whigs, and the Democratic Republicans behind Jackson eventually just called themselves Democrats, and this is the origin of the Democratic Party that we have today. And this is the origin of the second party system that lasted from the 1830s to the 1850s. Jackson's Democratic Party, like Jefferson's Republican Party, was in favor of states' rights, less national government power. You can see Henry Clay on the right there. His Whig Party was more nationalist, wanted more national government power. There was a series of third parties that I won't talk about today. We can talk about them in the Q&A if you want. But one of them was the Republican Party, and it eventually became one of the 2 major parties in 1860. And so the third party system lasted throughout the second half of the 19th century. The Democratic Party, led by people like President Grover Cleveland there on the left, wanted limited government, free markets, less government intervention in the economy, less national government power. The Republicans, led by people like Abraham Lincoln, were like the Whigs. Lincoln was a Whig previously, that wanted a national government that would protect American manufacturers with tariffs, that would invest in infrastructure, build roads and canals, and have a strong national bank. And the Republicans, of course, also wanted to reconstruct the rebellious South after the Civil War. There was a variety of third parties that emerged in the third party system. I won't talk about them, but in the fourth party system, most of these third parties were adopted into one of the 2 major parties. And during the fourth party system in the early 20th century, the Democratic Party was really a coalition of free marketers like Grover Cleveland and a new wing of the party called Populists, led by William Jennings Bryan, who was nominated 3 times, although he never became president. The Republicans likewise were a coalition of stand pat and progressive Republicans. So on the left of the Republicans, you can see Calvin Coolidge, who was kind of stand pat Republican, and Theodore Roosevelt, who was a progressive Republican. For the sake of time, I'll just kind of jump through these. The fifth party system emerged during the New Deal when Franklin D. Roosevelt created a new coalition. The free market or laissez-faire or classical liberal Democrats left the Democratic Party because they opposed FDR's New Deal. And FDR redefined liberalism. It used to mean free markets and limited government, and he redefined it to mean powerful government, interventionist government, interfering in markets. Lyndon B. Johnson pursued the Roosevelt vision with his Great Society, and Republicans began calling themselves conservatives. Barry Goldwater there, to the left of Reagan, was the first major party candidate to call himself a conservative. He opposed FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society. And Reagan, of course, was also a famously conservative Republican president. So the six-party system started in the after the Reagan period, and you had to move away from many Democrats, away from the Great Society and from traditional tax and spend liberalism. People like Bill Clinton called for a third way, declaring the era of big government is over, whereas many neoconservative Republicans like George W. Bush called for a compassionate conservatism that would actually expand government and increase government spending. Now, there is some question, are we in a new party system or are we still in the sixth party system? Are we in perhaps a seventh party system where the Democrats have become populist and under the sway of socialists like Bernie Sanders, whereas Republicans have also become populist and come under the sway of nationalists like Donald Trump. So both of these figures want to expand government power, who want to use government. And this is a question. Are these actually the two important dominating figures in the party? Or is Joe Biden actually the leader of the Democratic Party? And will Republicans repudiate some of the moves towards big government that we saw during the Trump era? That's a good question and an interesting question we can talk about in the Q&A. But one thing that I think is interesting to note just before I end is that in the new system, over the past half century, the political parties really can't control who they nominate for president anymore. The party organizations don't control this anymore. It used to be that all the party bosses would meet in the national convention and they would make deals and trade votes and work it out in smoke-filled back rooms. But now we have party primaries where voters who identify as either Democrat or Republican go to the polls and actually vote for who they want their party to nominate. So ordinary people now choose their party's presidential nominees. So you can have someone like Bernie Sanders, who never affiliated with the Democratic Party, who's always called himself an independent and a socialist, almost get the Democratic Party's nomination. Or someone like Donald Trump, who spent more of his life as a Democrat than a Republican, get the Republican Party's nomination, even though the entire establishment opposed him originally. Because primary voters voted for him, he got the nomination over the objections of all the party establishment. And all the party leaders had to get in line and eventually came around to Trump. So there's a new dynamic at work where the parties are in some ways weaker because they cannot control their own nomination process. Okay, so I had a couple questions there, but I will leave those for the Q&A, and I'll just finish with this reminder from Washington, where he says the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. And so I want us to think about the dangers that we might be moving toward if we continue down this path of partisan tribalism and hostility between our two major parties. Okay, that's the end of my slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, Verlan, it looks like there was a question in the chat from Jen Ferda, and her question was, who would you align the independent party with today? Historically, what political party do they most resemble?
The independent party?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when people call themselves independent, they're not actually aligning with any political party. And that's one of the interesting things about American politics is you do have the emergence of these minor third parties. So some people might say they're independent if they identify with, say, the Libertarian Party today or the Green Party today. So they can be independent of the two major parties, but maybe identify with one of these smaller parties, or maybe they just don't identify with either party. They say, I don't care for either party, and I'm just going to vote from election to election based on whichever party I think has nominated the better candidate, but I won't always vote for the same party.
Great. Are there any other questions? This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for this, Verlan. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, oh, one more, yay. Somebody had to type fast. Oh, nope, okay. If there are no other questions, I know if you're like me, sometimes the moment you hit the leave button, something immediately pops into your mind. I know everyone has my email address, so if something does pop into your mind and you have a question that you'd like to pose to Verlan, please feel free to send it to me, and we'll make sure that we get an answer for that question for you. We did record tonight's session, and we will be sharing the link to everyone who registered for the session. So if there's a portion that you want to go back and look at again, there were some fantastic quotes from our founders that were shared with us tonight. We'll make sure that you can access that. Um, it is a lot to absorb. I totally agree. There's so much great information that was presented tonight. Um, Lots of similarities. Absolutely, Jen. It's interesting to see how history kind of cycles through. Would you agree with that, Verlin, that as you kind of look back over the evolution of political parties, that you almost see some patterns develop?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are patterns and there's recurring themes. So one of the things I've been struck by just reading Washington's Farewell Address, I have my students read that in the classes I teach. It's remarkable, many things that come up that we haven't really seen in American history before, or at least in my lifetime, are now happening and were predicted by someone like Washington, where he talked about the alternate domination of one party over the other will lead to a kind of misery in society, that people will be motivated more by revenge than they would be by the common good. And that could pave the way for demagoguery. We've seen more of that in American politics over the last decade or so than any other time in my lifetime. Um, he also talked about, I didn't have a slide on this, Washington actually talked about foreign influence in American presidential elections. Again, it's not something that I'd ever thought much about in my, before, until 2016 and then 2020, this became a concern. And Washington's concern or worry was that if people become so attached to a political party that, and they're so intent on defeating the other party, that they will welcome help or support from a foreign enemy hostile to America. And that's not something we'd really seen over the past century, but now we're seeing it more and more. And I think the kind of partisanship that Washington warned us about has opened the door to exactly the kind of thing that he was concerned about.
Fascinating. All right, everyone. Well, Verlin, thank you so much for presenting tonight. Verlin will actually be joining us again next week. Or actually, I'm sorry, Sarah is joining us next week. We're going to be talking about the title of her session is Everything Schoolhouse Rock Left Out. She's going to talk to us about how Congress really works. And trust me, she knows, because she worked in those fantastic halls of Congress for many years, and she can give us the inside scoop. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And please feel free to spread the word about the series and get more of your friends here to join us. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you.